Most people who grew up in the 20th century had a house full of things they never thought twice about. A heavy rotating card file on the office desk, a clock radio glowing red on the nightstand, a matched set of encyclopedias filling an entire shelf that was built for no other purpose. These objects were ordinary. They were everywhere. And then, quietly, they were gone. Number 91 on this list was once considered the most advanced piece of technology in any American living room, and number 17 survived for nearly half a century before it disappeared in less than a decade. So hit subscribe and settle in, because here are 100 everyday objects that have become completely obsolete. Number 100, the Rolodex. For decades, the Rolodex sat on nearly every office desk in America. It was a simple rotating file, a drum of alphabetized cards held together by a metal frame, and it contained everything you needed to know about the people you did business with. Names, phone numbers, addresses, all written in ink or typed on individual cards that snapped in and out of the wheel, while tamed. A good Rolodex was a career asset. Salesmen guarded theirs the way a carpenter guards his tools. Secretaries kept them updated by hand, crossing out old numbers and penciling in new ones as companies moved or people changed jobs. By the early 1990s, the Rolodex Corporation was selling millions of units a year. Then digital contact lists arrived, first on computers, then on phones, and the entire concept of a physical address file became unnecessary overnight. Today, a Rolodex is the kind of thing you find at an estate sale priced at $2, with cards still inside that smell like decades of someone's working life. Number 99, the electric typewriter. Before personal computers took over, the electric typewriter was the workhorse of every office, every newsroom, and every college dormitory in America. IBM introduced the Selectric in 1961, and it changed everything. Instead of individual type bars swinging up to strike the ribbon, the Selectric used a spinning ball element that could be swapped out in seconds to change fonts. The sound it made was unmistakable, a rapid mechanical clatter that was faster and smoother than anything a manual machine could produce. Typing pools ran rows of them. Journalists banged out stories under deadline. Students stayed up all night retyping term papers because a single mistake on the final page meant starting that page over from scratch. By the mid-1980s, personal computers began to replace them, and by the mid-1990s, the electric typewriter had been pushed to the margins entirely. IBM stopped making the Selectric in 1984, and the silence in those old typing pools was permanent. Number 98, the pager. There was a time in the 1990s when hearing a sharp electronic beep from someone's belt clip was one of the most common sounds in America. The pager, or beeper, was a small plastic device that received short numeric messages, usually a phone number and a callback code. Doctors carried them, plumbers carried them, teenagers carried them. For about a decade, the pager was the fastest way to reach someone who was not sitting next to a telephone. Motorola dominated the market, selling millions of units a year through the mid-1990s. The most popular models clipped to your waistband and vibrated when a message came in, and if you were in a movie theater or a church, that vibration was the only thing standing between you and public embarrassment. Then the cell phone arrived and did everything the pager could do, plus more. By 2002, pager sales had collapsed. The beep that once meant someone needed you became a sound that nobody recognized anymore. Number 97. The fax machine. Every office in America had one by 1990. The fax machine sat in a corner, usually on its own stand, connected to a dedicated phone line, and it did one thing. It sent a piece of paper through a scanner, converted the image into audio tones, and transmitted those tones over a telephone wire to another fax machine that printed a copy on the other end. The process took about a minute per page. The paper it used was thermal stock, a slick, curling roll that faded if you left it in sunlight. Contracts were signed and faxed. Medical records were faxed. Lunch orders were faxed. The cover sheet alone became a piece of American office culture, with its checkbox for urgent and its line for the number of pages, including the cover. Email did not kill the fax overnight, but it made the machine feel instantly ancient. Some medical offices held on well into the 2010s, but the sound of a fax handshake, that screeching, warbling tone, is now a noise most people under 30 have never heard. Number 96. The bread box. It sat on the kitchen counter in almost every American home from the 1940s through the 1970s. The bread box was a simple metal or wooden container with a roll-top lid or a hinged door, designed to keep a loaf of bread fresh without refrigerating it. Most were made of painted tin or chrome-plated steel, and the better ones had a built-in cutting board that doubled as the lid. Families kept sandwich bread, dinner rolls, and sometimes donuts inside. The bread box worked because it trapped just enough humidity to keep the crust from going stale while allowing enough airflow to prevent mold. It was not complicated technology. It was a box. But it solved a real problem in the days before preservatives and plastic bags with twist ties extended shelf life to a week or more. Once commercial bread started arriving pre-sliced and sealed in airtight packaging, the bread box became redundant. By the 1980s, most kitchens had stopped using them, and the counter space that once belonged to the bread box went to the microwave instead.
Number 95. The fondue set.
In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the fondue set became the must-have centerpiece of any dinner party in America. It was a small pot, usually enameled cast iron or stainless steel, mounted on a stand above a burner fueled by sterno or denatured alcohol. The concept was simple. Melt cheese or chocolate in the pot and dip bread, fruit, or meat into it using long-handled forks. The Swiss had been doing it for generations, but American marketers turned it into a lifestyle product. Department stores sold fondue sets in every color. Wedding registries listed them alongside china and silverware. Cookbooks devoted entire chapters to fondue variations. For about a decade, no suburban gathering was complete without one. Then the novelty wore off. The sets migrated to the back of kitchen cabinets, then to garage sales, then to thrift stores. By the 1980s, fondue was a punchline for the decade that took entertaining too seriously. The pots were sturdy enough to last forever, which is why you can still find them at any secondhand shop in America, unused and waiting. Number 94. The pocket transistor radio. When Texas Instruments and Regency Electronics introduced the TR-1 in 1954, it cost $49.95, roughly the equivalent of $500 today. But it was portable, and that changed everything. For the first time, you could carry music and news in your shirt pocket. By the early 1960s, Japanese manufacturers like Sony and Panasonic had driven the price down to just a few dollars, and the transistor radio became one of the most common personal devices on Earth. Teenagers listened to rock and roll under the covers after bedtime. Construction workers clipped them to scaffolding. Beachgoers set them on towels and tuned in the top 40. The sound was tinny and the reception depended on which direction you were facing. But none of that mattered. The transistor radio gave people their own private soundtrack for the first time, and it held that role for nearly 3 decades before the Walkman and then the iPod took it away. Number 93. The 8-track tape player. The 8-track cartridge was a genuinely strange piece of engineering. It was a continuous loop of quarter-inch magnetic tape inside a plastic case the size of a paperback novel, playing in 4 stereo programs that the machine switched between automatically. Ford began offering 8-track players as a factory option in 1966, and for the next decade, the format dominated in-car music. You shoved the cartridge into the slot, it clicked, and music played. No rewinding, no flipping. The problem was the format. Songs were split across program changes, fading out mid-verse while the player made a loud mechanical clunk before resuming on the next program. Tape jams were constant. Cases cracked in parked car heat. By the late 1970s, the compact cassette had surpassed it, and by 1982, major labels stopped releasing on 8-track altogether. What remains are milk crates of warped cartridges at flea markets, priced at $0.25 each. Number 92. The boombox. Before headphones became the default way to listen to music in public, there was the boombox. It was a portable stereo, usually the size of a small suitcase, powered by as many as 10 D-cell batteries and capable of rattling windows from across the street. The biggest models, made by JVC, Sharp, and Panasonic, had dual cassette decks, a built-in equalizer with sliding knobs, and a carrying handle that required a strong arm. In the early 1980s, the boombox was a cultural statement. Break dancers in New York set them on flattened cardboard in public parks. Teenagers in the suburbs carried them to the pool. The thing was loud, it was visible, and it said something about the person carrying it. Cities eventually passed noise ordinances partly in response. By the late 1990s, portable CD players and then MP3 players made the boombox obsolete for personal listening, and Bluetooth speakers finished the job in the 2010s. The original machines were built like tanks, though. Some of them still work if you can find enough D batteries. Number 91. The VHS tape. For nearly 2 decades, the VHS cassette was how most Americans watched movies at home. The format won the war against Betamax in the early 1980s, not because it was technically superior, but because it offered longer recording times and wider studio support. A standard tape ran 2 hours on standard play, 6 on extended, and measured roughly 7.5 inches by 4 inches. Every household had a shelf full of them. Blank tapes for recording television shows, rental tapes with the blue Blockbuster sticker on the spine, Disney clamshell cases that children re-watched until the tracking went fuzzy. The tape itself was fragile. It stretched, it tangled, it degraded a little with every play, but it was cheap and it was everywhere. At its peak in the late 1990s, Americans were buying over 1 billion VHS tapes a year. The DVD arrived in 1997 and offered a picture so much sharper that the transition was swift. By 2006, the last major studio stopped releasing new films on VHS, and the format that had defined home entertainment for a generation was finished. Number 90. The electric carving knife. It showed up in American kitchens in the early 1960s and immediately became one of the most popular wedding gifts in the country. The electric knife was a simple device, 2 serrated blades that slid back and forth against each other at high speed, powered by a small motor in the handle. General Electric, Hamilton Beach, and Black & Decker all made versions, and by the mid-1960s nearly every suburban household owned one. It was marketed as the modern way to carve a Thanksgiving turkey, and for millions of families, that was the only day it came out of the drawer. The rest of the year it sat in its original box, wrapped in its cord, taking up space. Some home cooks used it for slicing bread or cutting through frozen foods, but most found that a sharp kitchen knife did the job without the noise or the vibration. By the 1990s, the electric knife had become one of those gifts everyone received and nobody needed. You can still buy one today, but almost nobody does. Number 89. The clock radio. For decades, the clock radio was the last thing millions of Americans looked at before falling asleep, and the first thing they heard in the morning. It was a combination device, an AM/FM radio built into a digital or flip number clock with a built-in alarm. General Electric made the most popular models, with glowing red LED digits that cast a faint light across the nightstand. You set the alarm by turning a dial on the back, and in the morning the radio clicked on to whatever station you had tuned in the night before. Waking up to music instead of a buzzer felt civilized. Some models had a snooze button on top, a feature so essential it became part of American humor. The clock radio held its place on the nightstand for nearly 40 years. Then the smartphone replaced it entirely. The alarm on a phone does everything the clock radio ever did, and it does not wake up the person sleeping next to you with a local disc jockey's voice at 6 in the morning. Number 88. The desk globe. There was a time when a globe was standard furniture. Schools had them in every classroom, and homes kept them in the study or the living room, usually on a wooden stand with a brass meridian ring. The best ones were made by Repligul or Rand McNally, hand-mounted on an axis that let you spin the sphere freely while tracing your finger from one continent to another. Children learned geography by turning the globe slowly and reading the names of countries they would never visit. The political globe had a short shelf life, though. Borders changed, countries were renamed, and a globe printed in 1975 showed a world that no longer existed by 1992. The Soviet Union alone erased an entire hemisphere of labels when it dissolved. Digital maps, GPS navigation, and satellite imagery made the physical globe unnecessary as a reference tool, and without that utility it became decoration. Some people still keep them, but more as conversation pieces than as anything they would actually consult. Number 87. The home intercom system. In the 1960s and 1970s, builders began wiring intercom systems into new suburban houses as a premium feature. Newtone dominated the market, and their units were typically flush-mounted in the wall with a speaker grill, a row of channel buttons, and sometimes a built-in AM/FM radio. The idea was efficiency. A parent in the kitchen could press a button and tell the kids upstairs that dinner was ready without raising a voice. A homeowner in the garage could answer the front door without walking through the house. In practice, the intercom was more novelty than necessity. The speaker quality was poor. The system required dedicated wiring through every wall, and most families found it easier to simply yell. By the 1990s, new construction had stopped including them, and the old Newtone panels became orphaned relics, painted over or covered with blank wall plates. Wireless smart speakers and video doorbells eventually delivered on the promise the home intercom had made decades earlier, but by then nobody remembered the original. Number 86. The disposable camera. Fujifilm introduced the Quick Snap in 1986, and Kodak followed with its own version shortly after. The disposable camera was exactly what it sounded like, a cheap plastic box with a fixed focus lens, a single roll of film preloaded inside, and a flash powered by one AA battery. You bought it at the drugstore for a few dollars, shot your 24 or 27 exposures, and dropped the entire camera off at the photo counter. A week later, you picked up your prints. The image quality was mediocre, the flash was weak, and the viewfinder was so small you could never quite frame the shot. None of that mattered. The disposable camera was what you brought to places where you would never risk a real camera. The beach, a concert, a wedding reception after midnight. It thrived for about 15 years. Then camera phones arrived in the early 2000s, and the entire concept of buying a camera you threw away after one use stopped making sense. Drugstores quietly pulled them from the checkout racks, and an entire category of casual photography disappeared with them. Number 85. The encyclopedia set. In millions of American homes from the 1950s through the 1980s, the encyclopedia set was the most expensive collection of books a family owned. A full Encyclopedia Britannica cost upwards of $1,400 by the late 1980s. World Book and Compton's offered cheaper alternatives, but even those ran into the hundreds. The books came in matching volumes bound in leatherette with gold-stamped spines, occupying a dedicated shelf in the den. Buying a set was a ritual. Door-to-door salesmen gave evening presentations, offered payment plans, and appealed to parental guilt. By the mid-1970s, the industry was generating hundreds of millions in annual revenue. A child doing a school report pulled the correct volume from the shelf and copied key sentences onto notebook paper. Looking something up was a physical act that took effort, and because it took effort, the information felt substantial. Microsoft Encarta appeared on CD-ROM in 1993. Wikipedia launched in 2001. Britannica stopped printing in 2012 after 244 years. The shelves that once held those gold-stamped volumes now hold family, photographs, or nothing at all. Number 84. The electric blanket. The electric blanket was a wintertime staple in American bedrooms from the 1950s through the 1980s. It was a standard blanket with thin heating wires woven through the fabric, connected to a control box that plugged into the wall. You turned a dial to choose your warmth level, and it heated up within minutes. The better models had dual controls, one for each side of the bed, solving one of the most common arguments in any American marriage. Sunbeam and General Electric were the dominant brands. Safety concerns slowed the market in the 1980s as reports of overheating and electrical shorts led to recalls. Modern central heating and better insulation made the heated blanket less necessary, and heated mattress pads eventually replaced it. The old electric blanket, with its stiff wires and its plastic dial, was always more comforting as an idea than as an object. Number 83. The portable CD player. Sony introduced the D50 in 1984, and for the next 15 years, the Discman was the portable music device of choice for anyone who wanted better sound quality than a cassette Walkman could deliver. It was about the size of a CD jewel case, circular and flat, with a hinged lid that opened to reveal the disc tray. You loaded a compact disc, pressed play, and clipped the device to your belt or dropped it into a bag. The problem was skipping. The slightest bump, a jog, a car hitting a pothole, sent the laser bouncing off the track and the music stuttering. Manufacturers eventually added anti-skip buffers that read ahead and stored a few seconds of audio in memory. But even the best models could not survive a serious run. The Discman also required you to carry your CDs, which meant a bulky zippered case and the constant risk of scratches on the disc surface. When the iPod arrived in 2001 with 1,000 songs stored on a hard drive the size of a deck of cards, the portable CD player became instantly, almost comically, obsolete. Number 82. The TV dinner. Swanson introduced the first one in 1953, packaging a complete meal of turkey, cornbread dressing, peas, and sweet potatoes inside a divided aluminum tray that went straight from the freezer into the oven. The name was deliberate. Swanson designed the packaging to look like a television set, and the entire concept was built for families eating in front of the screen instead of at the dining table. Number 1 perping sa panovertums. By the 1960s, TV dinners were a weeknight institution. The aluminum tray was lightweight, divided into 3 or 4 compartments, and the whole thing heated in about 25 minutes at 425 degrees. The mashed potatoes were always slightly grainy. The dessert compartment, usually apple cobbler, ran either scalding hot or still frozen in the center. None of that mattered. The TV dinner sold hundreds of millions of units. Swanson switched to plastic trays in the 1980s, and the meals moved from the oven to the microwave. But the original aluminum tray, the one you peeled back the foil on and ate from directly, belonged to a specific era of American domesticity that is not coming back. Number 81. The personal day planner. Before smartphones put calendars in everyone's pocket, the personal day planner was how organized adults kept track of their lives. The Franklin Planner, the Day Timer, and the Filofax were the dominant brands, and each had a devoted following. The Filofax, a leather-bound ring binder from England, became a status symbol among executives in the 1980s. They carried it to meetings the way earlier generations had carried briefcases. Inside were tabbed sections for daily schedules, monthly calendars, address pages, and blank note sheets, all printed on thin paper that snapped in and out of the rings. The Franklin Planner added a time management philosophy to the format, complete with prioritized task lists and goal-setting worksheets on every page. At its peak in the late 1990s, the paper planner industry was generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year in sales of binders, refill pages, and accessories. The PDA, starting with the Palm Pilot in 1997, began to chip away at the market, and the smartphone finished it. The ritual of sitting down each evening to fill in tomorrow's schedule, transferring undone tasks forward in ink, is now something only a handful of people still practice. Number 80. The milk chute. Walk through an older neighborhood in the Midwest or the Northeast, and look closely at houses built before 1960. On the exterior wall near the back entrance, you may spot a small metal door, about 12 inches square, set into the brick. That is the milk chute. It was a double-doored pass-through, so the milkman could place glass bottles inside without entering the house. The homeowner opened the inner door from the kitchen. In cold weather, the insulated compartment kept the milk from freezing. In warm weather, it kept the bottles out of the sun. The system worked perfectly for the era of home delivery, which lasted through the 1960s in most cities. Once supermarkets began selling milk in cartons at lower prices, the milkman stopped coming. Most chutes were sealed shut or drywalled over, but the small metal door is still visible on thousands of houses, rusting quietly. Number 79. The dial-up modem. The sound was unmistakable. A series of tones, hisses, and static bursts that lasted about 30 seconds as two machines negotiated a connection over an ordinary telephone line. The dial-up modem was how most Americans first accessed the internet, and for nearly a decade it was the only option available to home users. The fastest consumer models topped out at 56 kilobits per second, a speed so slow by current standards that loading a single high-resolution photograph could take minutes. Downloading a song took the better part of an hour. Streaming video was not possible. And while you were online, nobody else in the house could use the telephone. Get off the internet was a genuine source of household conflict throughout the late 1990s. America Online shipped millions of free trial discs in the mail, and the screech of the modem handshake became the soundtrack of an entire generation's introduction to email, chat rooms, and the web. Broadband connections began replacing dial-up in the early 2000s, and by 2010 the modem that had connected a nation was a relic. Number 78. The standalone VHS rewinder. This was a product that existed only because of a design flaw in another product. Rental stores charged rewind fees if you returned a tape without rewinding it, and signs reading "Be Kind, Rewind" hung in every Blockbuster and every independent video shop in America. Rewinding in the VCR itself was slow and put wear on the machine's internal mechanism, so in the late 1980s manufacturers began selling standalone rewinders. They were small plastic boxes, often shaped like a sports car or a jet fighter for reasons nobody could explain. And they did exactly one thing: rewind a VHS tape at high speed. You popped the cassette in, pressed a button, and the tape spooled back to the beginning in about 90 seconds. At their peak, these devices sold for $10 to $15 at department stores and drugstores. The entire product category existed because of rental culture. And when DVDs replaced VHS tapes, the rewinder became pointless overnight. It is one of the purest examples of an everyday object that solved a problem that simply stopped existing. Number 77. The cassette tape. The compact cassette was the most democratic music format ever produced. Philips introduced it in 1963, and by the 1970s it had become the worldwide standard for portable and personal music. The cassette was small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, durable enough to survive being tossed in a glove compartment, and cheap enough that blank tapes cost less than $1. And that last point was everything. The cassette tape made copying music easy and personal. You could record an album from a friend's collection, tape songs off the radio, or assemble a mixtape, choosing every track in a deliberate order and writing the song titles on the insert card by hand. The mixtape became a cultural artifact of its own, a personal statement disguised as a gift. Record labels spent years fighting home taping, but the practice only grew. At its commercial peak, the cassette outsold vinyl records worldwide. The compact disc overtook it in the early 1990s, and digital downloads finished it. What remains are shoeboxes full of unlabeled tapes in closets across the country, holding music and voice recordings that most people no longer have a machine to play. Number 76. The dictaphone. Before voice memos on smartphones, before even portable tape recorders became affordable, the dictaphone was how executives, doctors, and lawyers captured their thoughts for transcription. The original machines used wax cylinders, later replaced by magnetic belts, then standard cassettes and microcassettes. The workflow was always the same. The professional spoke into a handheld microphone, recording letters, reports, or case notes at the pace of natural speech. The recording was handed off to a secretary or transcriptionist who played it back through a foot-pedal-controlled playback unit and typed out every word. Entire professions depended on this system. Doctors dictated patient notes after hospital rounds. Lawyers dictated briefs between court appearances. Business executives dictated correspondence rather than writing it by hand. The Dictaphone Corporation, founded in 1907, became so synonymous with the device that its brand name was used generically, the way people say Kleenex or Xerox. Personal computers with word processing software began replacing dictation in the 1980s, and voice recognition technology accelerated the decline. Today, the idea of speaking your thoughts into a machine so another person can type them out sounds almost futile. Number 75. The Laserdisc Player. Before the DVD, there was the Laserdisc, and almost nobody bought one. The format launched in 1978, offering video quality that was dramatically better than VHS, stored on a shiny 12-inch disc that looked like an oversized vinyl record. Pioneer was the primary manufacturer, and movie enthusiasts who could afford the players and the discs swore by the picture quality. The problem was everything else. The discs were heavy and awkward to store. A single movie often required flipping the disc or swapping to a second one halfway through. The players cost several $100s when a VCR could be had for much less, and you could not record on a Laserdisc, which meant it would never replace the VCR for taping television shows. The format never captured more than about 2% of the American home video market. It survived for 2 decades on the loyalty of a small, passionate audience of collectors and home theater enthusiasts. The DVD delivered comparable quality in a smaller, cheaper, recordable package, and the Laserdisc finally went silent. Number 74. The Phone Book. Once a year, a thick volume wrapped in yellow or white appeared on the front porch of nearly every home and business in America. The phone book was a comprehensive printed directory of names, addresses, and telephone numbers for an entire city or region, set in small type on thin paper and bound in a soft cover. The white pages listed residential numbers alphabetically. The yellow pages organized businesses by category, with paid advertisements filling the margins. In a large city, the combined book could run over 1,000 pages and weigh several pounds. People used it constantly, to find a plumber, to check a neighbor's number, to settle an argument about whether someone actually lived where they claimed. Phone companies printed hundreds of millions of copies a year. The directories began shrinking in the 2000s as search engines made the printed book redundant, and by the 2010s, most carriers had stopped delivering them altogether. The ones that still arrive sit on porches uncollected, thinner every year. Number 73. The CRT Computer Monitor. For the first 2 decades of personal computing, the cathode ray tube monitor was the only screen available. It was enormous, heavy, and deep. A standard 17-inch model weighed over 40 pounds and extended more than 18 inches behind the screen. The glass tube inside fired electron beams at a phosphor-coated surface to create the image, and the entire assembly generated enough heat to warm a small room. Offices stacked them on reinforced desks. The screens flickered at refresh rates that gave some people headaches, and the static charge on the glass attracted enough dust to leave a visible film after a few days. Flat-panel LCD monitors began appearing in the early 2000s, and the transition was fast. The LCD was lighter, thinner, cooler, and easier on the eyes. Within a few years, the CRT went from standard equipment to landfill material. Recycling centers still struggle with the remnants, because the leaded glass inside each tube requires special handling that makes disposal expensive. Number 72. The Ronco Rotisserie Oven. Ron Popeil was the king of the television infomercial, and the Ronco Showtime Rotisserie was his masterpiece. Introduced in 1998, It was a compact countertop oven with a motorized spit that rotated a whole chicken, a roast, or a rack of ribs behind a curved glass door, while a drip tray caught the fat below. The selling point was the tagline, 5 words that entered the American vocabulary and never left: set it and forget it. Popal demonstrated the product himself on late-night television, loading a chicken onto the spit, closing the door, and walking away to let the machine do the work. He sold over 8 million units in the first 5 years alone. The infomercials ran constantly on cable channels, and watching Ron Popeil cook a turkey at 2 in the morning became a strange kind of American ritual. The rotisserie itself worked exactly as advertised. The chicken came out evenly browned and juicy, and the cleanup was straightforward. But the machine was bulky, and most kitchens did not have the counter space to leave it out permanently. It migrated to the top of the refrigerator, then to the garage shelf, then to the donation pile. Popeil died in 2021, and the Ronco brand changed hands several times. The countertop rotisserie still exists in updated forms, but the original Showtime, with its curved glass door and its promise that you could walk away, belonged to a specific era of televised selling that has largely moved online. The tagline outlived the product by years. Number 71. The Lava Lamp. Invented by a British accountant named Edward Craven Walker in 1963, the lava lamp was a tall, tapered glass vessel filled with translucent liquid and a colored wax that rose and fell in slow, blobby formations when heated by a bulb in the base. It did nothing useful. It produced almost no light. It took about an hour to warm up before the wax started moving. And yet it became one of the most iconic decorative objects of the 1960s and 1970s, a fixture in college dorm rooms and teenage bedrooms across America. The original Lava Light brand sold millions. The appeal was purely hypnotic. You watched the wax blobs, separate, float upward, stretch, merge, and sink back down in an endless cycle. As a cultural symbol, it peaked during the psychedelic era and then faded, only to return briefly in the 1990s as a retro novelty. Today it survives mostly in novelty shops and as a visual shorthand for a decade that valued atmosphere over function. Number 70. The Floppy Disk. The floppy disk was the primary method of storing and transferring computer files for nearly 20 years. The original 8-inch version appeared in the early 1970s, followed by the 5¼ inch disc that became standard on early personal computers, and finally the 3½ inch rigid disc that most people remember. That last version, introduced by Sony in 1981, held 1.44 megabytes of data, enough for a few word processing documents or a handful of small images. Software came on floppies. School assignments were saved on floppies. Office workers carried them in shirt pockets and briefcases. The disk was fragile. Magnets erased it, heat warped it, and a fingerprint on the exposed magnetic surface could corrupt the data. By the late 1990s, writable CDs offered hundreds of times more storage, and USB flash drives made the floppy feel absurd. The last major computer manufacturer to include a floppy drive as standard was Dell, which dropped it in 2003. The save icon on most software still looks like a floppy disk, a tiny monument to a format most young users have never held. Number 69. The Zip Drive. In the mid-1990s, Iomega introduced the zip drive as the successor to the floppy disk, and for a brief window it looked like the future of portable storage. A single zip disk held 100 megabytes, nearly 70 times the capacity of a standard floppy. The disks were slightly larger and thicker than a floppy, and the drive connected to a computer via a parallel port or later USB. Creative professionals and college students adopted it quickly. Iomega sold tens of millions of drives and disks within the first few years. Then the format hit a wall. The disks were expensive, running $8 to $10 each. A defect known as the click of death caused some drives to destroy their own disks, and competition was closing in fast. Writable CDs were cheaper per megabyte, and by the early 2000s, USB flash drives offered more storage in a device the size of a thumb. The zip drive went from essential to forgotten in less than a decade, one of the fastest rises and falls in consumer technology history. Number 68. The Palm Pilot. In 1997, the Palm Pilot became the first personal digital assistant that ordinary people actually wanted to own. It was a handheld device about the size of a deck of cards, with a small monochrome touchscreen and a stylus for input. You tapped icons to open a calendar, an address book, a to-do list, and a memo pad. Data synced to a desktop computer through a cradle. The handwriting recognition system, called graffiti, required learning a simplified alphabet of single-stroke characters drawn on a small input area at the bottom of the screen. Palm sold over 1 million units in its first 18 months. Executives, doctors, and salespeople carried them everywhere. For a few years, pulling out a Palm at a meeting was a signal that you were organized and current. Then the smartphone arrived. The BlackBerry combined a PDA with a phone and email, and the iPhone in 2007 made the standalone PDA obsolete entirely. The Palm brand survived through several owners but never recovered. Number 67. The dedicated word processor. Before personal computers were affordable, the dedicated word processor occupied a strange middle ground between the typewriter and the computer. It was a machine built for one purpose: typing, editing, and printing documents. The most popular models, made by Wang, Brother, and Smith Corona, had a small built-in screen, sometimes displaying only a few lines of text and a keyboard. You typed your document, made corrections on screen, and printed the final version on a built-in daisy wheel or attached printer. The advantage over a typewriter was obvious. Mistakes could be fixed without retyping the entire page. The advantage over a computer was price. A dedicated word processor cost a few $100s in the late 1980s, while a personal computer with word processing software cost over $1,000. But the PC did everything a word processor could, plus 1,000 other things. By the early 1990s, the price gap had closed, and the dedicated word processor disappeared from stores almost overnight. Number 66. The 35mm film canister. It was a small black plastic cylinder with a gray snap-on lid, about 1.5 inches tall, and for decades it was one of the most common throwaway containers in America. Every roll of 35mm camera film came packaged inside one. Photographers popped the lid, pulled out the film cartridge, loaded it into the camera, and pocketed the empty canister. The canisters accumulated everywhere, in junk drawers, in camera bags, on darkroom shelves. They were perfectly sized for holding coins, buttons, pills, sewing needles, fishing hooks, or small screws. Children used them for science fair projects. Travelers carried spices in them. Backpackers stored matches inside. The canister was never the product, just the packaging. But it became so useful that people saved them by the dozen. When digital cameras eliminated the need for film, the canisters stopped arriving, and a surprisingly versatile little container quietly vanished from everyday life. Number 65. The typewriter eraser wheel. It was a flat, circular disc of abrasive rubber, about the diameter of a $50 coin, attached to a small, stiff brush on the opposite end. The eraser was designed specifically for removing typed characters from paper. You rubbed the abrasive surface over the wrong letter, grinding away the ink along with a thin layer of the paper, then used the brush to sweep away the crumbs before retyping the correct character in its place. Membless. Every typist kept one within reach. The discs wore down with use, and aggressive erasing could tear through the paper entirely, meaning the page had to be started over. Experienced secretaries and students developed a light, practiced touch that removed the ink cleanly without damaging the sheet. The correction ribbon, and later liquid correction fluid, reduced the need for the wheel, and word processors eliminated it altogether. By the 1990s, the typewriter eraser had vanished from office supply stores. It was a tool built for a world where a single wrong keystroke was a physical problem that required a physical solution. Number 64. The magnetic photo album. From the 1970s through the 1990s, the magnetic photo album was how most American families organized their printed photographs. It was a large bound book with thick cardboard pages coated in adhesive and overlaid with a clear plastic film. You peeled back the plastic, pressed your photos onto the sticky surface, and smoothed the film back down. No photo corners, no glue, no fuss. The albums came in every color and were sold at drugstores and department stores everywhere. The problem was the adhesive. Over time, the acid in the glue yellowed the photographs, bonded permanently to the print surface, and made removal nearly impossible without tearing the image. Preservationists warned about the damage for years, but the convenience was hard to resist. Millions of family photographs from the 1970s and 1980s are now stuck to deteriorating pages in albums sitting in closets and attics across the country. Digital photography eventually made printed photo organization unnecessary for most people, and the magnetic album joined the list of products that solved one problem while quietly creating another. Number 63. The cigarette case. There was a time when carrying a polished metal cigarette case was as natural as carrying a wallet. The cases were slim, rectangular, and usually made of silver plate, chrome, or brass, with a spring-loaded clasp that snapped open to reveal 2 rows of neatly arranged cigarettes held in place by an elastic band or a thin metal bar. Men carried them in jacket pockets. Women carried smaller, more decorative versions in evening bags. The cigarette case was both practical and performative. It kept the cigarettes from being crushed, but it also turned the act of offering someone a smoke into a small social ritual. Engraved cases were popular gifts for graduations, retirements, and milestones as smoking rates declined through the 1980s and 1990s, and as public smoking bans made the gesture less welcome, the cigarette case lost its audience. Today they turn up in antique shops and estate sales, often still carrying a faint smell of tobacco decades after the last cigarette was removed. Number 62. The bonnet hair dryer. Before the handheld blow dryer became standard in the 1970s, American women dried their hair under a bonnet dryer. It was a small electric heating unit about the size of a hat box, connected by a flexible hose to a soft plastic bonnet that fitted over the head like a shower cap. You set your hair in rollers, pulled the bonnet down over them, turned the dial, and sat still for 20 to 40 minutes while warm air circulated around your curlers. Portable models folded into carrying cases the size of a small suitcase. Salon versions were larger, with rigid dome-shaped hoods mounted on adjustable stands. The bonnet dryer was slow, noisy, and confining, but it was the standard tool for achieving the tightly curled hairstyles that dominated from the 1950s through the late 1960s. The handheld blow dryer freed women from the bonnet, and the looser, more natural hairstyles of the 1970s made the roller and bonnet routine feel like a relic almost overnight. Number 61. The electric pencil sharpener. For decades, the electric pencil sharpener sat on the front desk of nearly every classroom and on the counter of nearly every office in America. It was a compact, motor-driven device. You inserted a pencil into the opening, the motor engaged with a whirring sound, and a set of rotating blades shaved the wood and graphite into a perfect conical point. The shavings collected in a small removable tray underneath. The sound of the electric sharpener was part of the background noise of any workspace. Children lined up to use the one on the teacher's desk, and the experienced ones learned to hold the pencil steady and pull it out at exactly the right moment to avoid grinding it down to a stub. Boston and X-Acto were the dominant brands. Mechanical pencils and ballpoint pens reduced demand over the years, and the shift to digital devices in classrooms pushed the electric sharpener further to the margins. Many of the ones still in use today are the same machines that were bolted to a desk 30 years ago, still whirring away. Number 60. The Jell-O mold. From the 1950s through the 1970s, the Jell-O mold was one of the most essential items in an American kitchen. It was a shaped metal or copper form, often in the outline of a ring, a fish, a star, or an elaborate fluted dome, used to set gelatin desserts and salads into decorative shapes for the table. Jell-O had been popular since the early 1900s, but the post-war era turned molded gelatin into an art form. Cookbooks published recipes that suspended fruit, vegetables, and sometimes meat or seafood inside shimmering, colorful domes. The molds were displayed on kitchen walls when not in use, often in rows of graduated sizes. The trend peaked in the 1960s when a well-executed Jell-O mold was a genuine point of pride at potlucks and holiday dinners. By the 1980s, changing tastes and a growing skepticism about processed foods sent the mold into retirement. The copper and aluminum forms still turn up at antique stores, polished and priced as decoration rather than kitchen tools.
Number 59. The Trapper Keeper.
Mead Corporation introduced the Trapper Keeper in 1978, and within a few years it became the single most coveted school supply in America. It was a combination binder, folder, and notebook system held together by a Velcro flap, and it came in a rotating lineup of colorful designs featuring everything from race cars to kittens to geometric patterns. The folders inside had vertical pockets that kept loose papers from sliding out, and the 3-ring binder held standard notebook paper. For students in the 1980s and early 1990s, choosing your Trapper Keeper design before the school year was a serious decision. It said something about who you were or who you wanted to be. At its peak, Mead was selling tens of millions of dollars in Trapper Keepers annually. Some schools eventually banned them for being too bulky to fit inside standard desks. Digital note-taking and laptops in classrooms reduced the need for physical binders, and the Trapper Keeper faded from back-to-school lists. It remains one of the most nostalgic school supplies of the late 20th century. Number 58. The Telex Machine. Before the fax, before email, and before instant messaging, there was the Telex. It was a teleprinter system that transmitted typed text over dedicated telegraph lines between businesses, government offices, and news agencies around the world. The machines looked like oversized typewriters connected to a telephone-style rotary dial, and they clattered constantly in the communications rooms of corporations, embassies, and wire services from the 1930s through the 1980s. Operating a telex required a specific protocol. You dialed the recipient's number, waited for a confirmation code called an answer back, and typed your message in real time. The receiving machine printed the text simultaneously on a continuous roll of paper. Every word cost money because telex charges were calculated by connection time, which is why telex messages were famously terse. Abbreviations, no articles, no pleasantries. Number 5. The global telex network peaked in the mid-1980s with roughly 1.5 million subscribers worldwide. Reuters, the Associated Press, and United Press International ran their entire news distribution on telex. International banks used it for funds transfer confirmations. Shipping companies coordinated cargo across oceans with it. For half a century, the telex was the backbone of global business communication. The fax machine wounded it in the late 1980s by transmitting documents with graphics and signatures over ordinary phone lines. Email finished it in the 1990s by eliminating the cost-per-minute model entirely. By the year 2000, the telex network was effectively abandoned. The machines were scrapped for parts or donated to museums, and the staccato clatter of the teleprinter became a sound that belongs entirely to the past. Number 57. The Desk Blotter Calendar. The desk blotter was a large rectangular pad, usually about 2 feet by 18 inches, that covered the center of a desk and served two purposes at once. The surface was a soft, absorbent paper that protected the desk finish and caught ink drips from fountain pens. Printed monthly calendars ran along both sides, with space for jotting appointments and reminders. Leather or vinyl corner pieces held the sheet in place, and when the paper filled up with notes and ink stains, you slid out the old sheet and replaced it with a fresh one. The desk blotter was standard office furniture from the 1920s through the 1970s. Insurance agents, attorneys, and school principals all worked behind one. The combination of ballpoint pens, which did not drip, and desktop computers, which replaced handwritten scheduling, made the blotter unnecessary. By the 1990s, it had largely disappeared, surviving only on the desks of people who valued tradition over efficiency. Number 56. The mechanical kitchen timer. It was a small, round device, usually white or chrome, that sat on the counter or stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. You twisted the dial to the desired number of minutes, and a spring-driven mechanism ticked audibly until the time expired and a bell rang. No batteries, no electricity, no display. The mechanical timer was pure analog engineering, and it worked the same way for 50 years without changing. Every kitchen had one, and the sound of its ticking became part of the rhythm of cooking dinner. Bakers relied on it for precision. Parents set it for everything from boiling eggs to limiting how long the children watched television. The tick was constant, and the ring was sharp, a genuine brass bell inside most models that could be heard from any room in the house. Digital timers replaced them in the 1990s, and smartphones made even those seem redundant. The mechanical kitchen timer still works perfectly if you can find one, but winding a dial to track time feels ancient in a kitchen full of glowing screens. Number 55. The egg slicer. It was a small hinged device, usually cast aluminum, with a set of thin stainless steel wires strung across the top half. You placed a hard-boiled egg in the oval cradle on the bottom, pressed the wired frame down, and the wires cut the egg into perfectly even rounds in one clean motion. Every kitchen drawer in America seemed to contain one between the 1950s and the 1980s. It was a single-purpose tool that did its job flawlessly. Some versions could handle mushrooms or strawberries as well, but the egg was the point. The egg slicer thrived in the era of composed salads, deviled egg platters, and garnished dinner plates, when presentation mattered and uniform slices were expected. As cooking became more casual and kitchen drawers were cleared of single-purpose gadgets in favor of a good knife and a cutting board, the egg slicer quietly retreated to the back of the utensil drawer and then out of the kitchen altogether. Number 54. The electric frying pan. In the 1950s and 1960s, the electric frying pan was one of the most popular small appliances in the American kitchen. It was a square or rectangular skillet with a built-in heating element, a detachable temperature control probe, and usually a vented glass lid. Sunbeam, Presto, and West Bend were the leading brands. The selling point was precise, even heat. You dialed the exact temperature, and the thermostat held it steady, which made the electric skillet more reliable than a stovetop burner. Families used it for frying chicken, making pancakes, and cooking entire casseroles on the counter without turning on the oven. It was especially valued in summer, when heating up the kitchen was the last thing anyone wanted. At its peak, the electric frying pan was in more American homes than the toaster oven, but modern cooktops with better controls and the rise of slow cookers and air fryers pushed the electric skillet out of regular use. It is still manufactured today, but it no longer holds the prime counter position it once owned. Number 53. The printing calculator. Every accountant, bookkeeper, and office manager in America kept one on the desk. The printing calculator was an electronic calculator with a built-in roll of paper tape that recorded every entry and calculation as you worked. The paper fed out of a slot at the top of the machine, curling into a long strip that served as a physical record of the math. You could tear off the tape, staple it to a document, and hand it to a supervisor as proof that the numbers had been checked. The keys were oversized and made a satisfying click with every press. Adding columns of figures produced a rhythmic tapping that was the background music of every accounting office in the 1970s and 1980s. Sharp, Canon, Casio, and Texas Instruments all made popular models. Spreadsheet software on personal computers replaced the printing calculator for most purposes by the early 1990s, though some old-school bookkeepers held on to theirs well into the 2000s, trusting a paper tape more than a glowing screen. Number 52. The portable television. Long before tablets and smartphones put video in every pocket, the portable television was the only way to watch a broadcast outside the living room. These were small sets, usually with screens between 5 and 9 inches, housed in compact plastic cases with a carrying handle and a telescoping antenna. Sony's Watchman, introduced in 1982, was the most famous, a flat black and white unit with a tiny screen that fit in a large coat pocket. Earlier portables from the 1960s were bulkier, with cathode ray tubes that drained batteries fast. People brought them to the beach, to the ballpark, and to the backyard. Offices kept them in break rooms. Patients watched them from hospital beds. The picture was poor, the antenna reception was unreliable, and the battery life was short. But watching television outside the house felt like freedom. The switch to digital broadcasting in 2009 rendered most analog portable sets useless overnight, and streaming on mobile devices made the entire product category extinct. Number 51. The folding card table. Every American household seemed to own at least one. It was a square table, usually about 34 inches across, with a padded vinyl top and 4 folding metal legs that collapsed flat for storage in a closet or against a garage wall. Samsonite was the best-known brand. The card table came out for poker nights, bridge games, holiday overflow seating, jigsaw puzzles, and craft projects. At Thanksgiving and Christmas, it became the children's table, set apart from the main dining table and covered with a vinyl cloth nobody cared about staining. The legs locked into place with a simple latch, and the whole thing could be set up or taken down in 10 seconds. It was not elegant, but it was always there when you needed a flat surface and an extra seat or two. Casual entertaining has moved away from seated card games, and most families today do not need a spare table that folds flat. The ones that survive are the same ones that have been in the family for decades, still functional, still slightly wobbly on one leg. Number 50. The VCR head cleaner. If you owned a VCR in the 1980s or 1990s, you eventually needed a head cleaner. It looked like a regular VHS cassette, but instead of magnetic tape, it contained a strip of slightly abrasive cleaning material, sometimes moistened with a few drops of isopropyl alcohol from a small bottle included in the package. You inserted it into the VCR, pressed play, and the cleaning strip wiped the buildup off the video heads inside the machine. The process took about 30 seconds. Over time, the heads in a VCR accumulated oxide residue from the tape, which caused the picture to become fuzzy, streaky, or filled with static. A head cleaning tape restored the image, at least temporarily. TDK, Maxell, and Memorex all sold versions, and they were stocked on the same shelf as blank tapes at every electronics store. The VCR head cleaner was one of those products that existed entirely in service of another product, and when the VCR itself became obsolete, the cleaning tape went with it, silently and without ceremony. Number 49. The metal pencil box. Before the zip-up fabric pencil case became the standard, most school children carried their supplies in a flat metal box about the size of a paperback book. It had a hinged lid, sometimes decorated with cartoon characters or geometric patterns, and a removable tray inside that created 2 layers of storage. Pencils, erasers, a small ruler, and a sharpener fit neatly in the top tray, with extra supplies underneath. The box closed with a satisfying metallic snap. The metal pencil box was durable enough to survive being dropped, thrown, and sat upon, which was important given the way children treated their belongings. Some boxes had built-in multiplication tables printed on the inside of the lid, a feature that doubled as a cheat sheet during math tests. By the 1990s, plastic and fabric cases had largely replaced the metal version, and the decorated tin pencil box became a collector's item rather than a school supply. Number 48. The wired television remote control. Before the infrared remote became standard, some television sets came with a remote control connected to the set by a long, thin cable. Zenith introduced one, of the earliest versions in the 1950s. And by the 1970s, several manufacturers offered wired remotes on their higher-end models. The cable ran from the remote handset to the television, usually about 15 feet, and the remote itself had a few basic buttons: channel up, channel down, volume, and power. The wire ran across the living room floor, under rugs, and behind furniture, creating a tripping hazard that everyone in the household learned to navigate. The advantage was reliability. There were no batteries to replace and no signal to aim. The disadvantage was obvious. You were tethered to the television by a cord. Wireless infrared remotes replaced the wired version in the early 1980s, and within a few years the idea of a remote that physically connected to the set seemed absurd. Number 47. The countertop electric can opener. For decades, the electric can opener held a permanent spot on the American kitchen counter, usually tucked into the corner next to the toaster. It was a compact, upright device with a cutting wheel and a magnetic lid holder. You hooked the rim of the can under the blade, pressed the lever, and the motor rotated the can against the cutter, slicing the lid off in a smooth circle. The lid stuck to the magnet so it would not fall into the food. Rival and Hamilton Beach were the dominant brands. Many models included a knife sharpener built into the back, a small grinding wheel that few people ever used. The electric can opener was such a fixture that kitchens were often designed with a dedicated outlet near the counter edge just for it. Pull-tab cans, pop-top lids, and the simple handheld rotary openers slowly eroded its position. By the 2000s, most new kitchens no longer assumed the presence of a countertop can opener, and the device retreated to thrift store shelves alongside the electric knife. Number 46. The letter opener. It sat in desk drawers and pen cups in offices and homes across America. A slender blade with a handle, usually about 8 inches long, designed for one purpose: slitting open sealed envelopes. The better ones were made of brass or stainless steel with wooden or bone handles. Cheaper versions were stamped metal, sometimes given away as promotional items with a company name printed on the blade. Some were ornamental, shaped like swords or daggers, and these turned up as gifts for Father's Day and retirements. Using a letter opener was a small daily ritual. You slid the blade under the flap, drew it across in one motion, and the envelope opened cleanly without tearing the contents inside.
No.
As personal and business mail shifted to email and online billing, the volume of physical letters dropped sharply. The letter opener lost its daily purpose and became something you found in an old desk, still sharp, still functional, waiting for mail that would never come. Number 45. The console stereo. Before component systems and long before wireless speakers, the console stereo was furniture as much as audio equipment. It was a large wooden cabinet, often 3 or 4 feet long, housing a radio tuner, a record turntable, and speakers behind a decorative cloth grill. Magnavox, Zenith, and RCA made the finest models, finished in walnut or mahogany veneer. The console occupied a prominent spot in the living room. You lifted the turntable lid, placed the record on the platter, set the needle, and closed the lid while music filled the room. By the late 1960s, audiophiles began favoring separate components: a standalone amplifier, turntable, and speakers, each chosen for quality. The component system offered better sound and more flexibility than the monolithic console, which was also heavy and impractical for renters. By the 1980s, new consoles were rare, and the ones already in homes were aging out. Many ended up on the curb, stripped of their turntables by hobbyists who left the beautiful wooden shells behind. Today, a vintage Magnavox console is worth more as mid-century furniture than as an audio device. Number 44. The handheld electronic game. Before the Game Boy and before smartphones, portable gaming meant a single-purpose plastic device that played one game and one game only. Mattel's Auto Race, released in 1976, was the first, a small red unit with LED blips that represented a car weaving through traffic. Then came Simon in 1978, the circular four-color memory game that beeped out patterns of increasing difficulty. Merlin followed, and Coleco produced a line of tabletop arcade games that miniaturized Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong. These devices ran on batteries, had tiny screens or simple LED displays, and produced sounds that were more beep than music. They were everywhere in the early 1980s, stuffed into Christmas stockings and carried on road trips. The Game Boy arrived in 1989 with interchangeable cartridges, and the single-purpose electronic game lost its appeal almost immediately. Why own a device that played one game when you could own one that played dozens? The old handhelds disappeared into toy boxes and junk drawers, their batteries slowly corroding inside their sealed compartments. Number 43, the ice pick. For the better part of a century, the ice pick was a standard kitchen tool. It was a simple device, a sturdy wooden handle attached to a sharp steel spike, about 5 inches long. Its purpose was breaking apart blocks of ice before electric refrigerators with built-in freezers became common in the 1940s and 1950s. Most households relied on an ice box cooled by a large block of ice delivered to the door. The ice pick chipped the block into smaller pieces that fit inside pitchers, glasses, and coolers. Even after refrigerators became universal, the ice pick lingered in kitchen drawers for decades, used to break apart ice that had clumped together in the freezer tray. Boom-biddy-thun, the tool was sharp, effective, and dangerous. It was essentially a small weapon sitting in a drawer next to the spatulas. As automatic ice makers became standard in home refrigerators, and as bagged ice became cheap and available at every gas station and convenience store, the ice pick lost its last practical function. Most people under 50 have never used one. Number 42, the 1-hour photo counter. From the mid-1980s through the early 2000s, the 1-hour photo counter was a fixture in drugstores and shopping malls across America. You walked in with a roll of exposed film, dropped it into an envelope, and came back in an hour to pick up your photographs. Before that, getting film developed meant waiting days. The speed was revolutionary. The envelopes of freshly printed photographs became a communal event. Families gathered around the kitchen table and flipped through them, laughing at the bad shots and debating which ones deserved a frame. Digital cameras eliminated the film, and the 1-hour counter vanished from storefronts in less than a decade. The ritual of dropping off a roll and coming back later to discover what you had captured is gone. Number 41, the cassette adapter for car stereos. It was one of the cleverest workarounds in consumer electronics history. The cassette adapter was a device shaped like a standard compact cassette, with a thin cable running out of one end to a headphone jack. You inserted the adapter into the car's cassette deck, plugged the cable into a portable CD player or later an iPod, and the adapter transmitted the audio signal through the cassette player's own reed head to the car speakers. It was not elegant, but it worked. The sound quality was decent, the price was under $10, and it required no installation. For millions of drivers in the late 1990s and 2000s, the cassette adapter was the bridge between old and new technology, letting a car built in 1993 play music from a device built in 2005. The adapter became unnecessary when car manufacturers started including auxiliary input jacks and Bluetooth connectivity as standard features. But for about a decade, that little fake cassette with its dangling wire was the single most practical gadget in America. Number 40, the film developing envelope. It was a small paper sleeve, usually printed with the logo of Kodak, Fujifilm, or a local drugstore, and it was one of the most familiar pieces of packaging in American life for decades. When you finished a roll of film, you placed the cartridge inside the envelope, filled in your name and address, checked a box for the number of prints and the finish, glossy or matte, and dropped it off at the photo counter. Some envelopes were prepaid and could be mailed directly to a processing lab. The envelope was the first step in a process that turned a strip of exposed film into a stack of printed photographs, and opening the finished envelope when you picked it up was one of the small pleasures of the analog era. You never quite knew what you had until you saw the prints. Some shots were perfect, some were blurry, some were accidentally beautiful. That element of surprise vanished when digital cameras gave you an instant preview on a screen, and the film developing envelope, that humble little sleeve, disappeared with it. Number 39. The penny scale. Drugstores, 5 and dime shops, grocery stores, and bus station lobbies all had them. The penny scale was a large upright coin-operated machine that weighed you for 1 cent. You stepped onto the platform, dropped a penny into the slot, and the machine displayed your weight on a large dial or a printed card that slid out of a slot. Some models dispensed a small fortune card along with the weight reading, combining a practical function with a bit of carnival novelty. The Watling Scale Company and the National Novelty Company were among the biggest manufacturers. At their peak in the 1940s and 1950s, there were hundreds of thousands of penny scales in public places across America. Home bathroom scales eventually became affordable and accurate, enough to make the public weigh in unnecessary. The penny itself lost value, and the cost of servicing the machines outpaced the revenue they generated. By the 1970s, most had been removed. A few survive in antique malls and vintage diners, still operational, still taking pennies that are now worth less than the electricity needed to run the mechanism. Number 38. The cigarette vending machine. They stood in the lobbies of restaurants, bowling alleys, bars, hotel hallways, and office building, break rooms. The cigarette vending machine was a tall, narrow box with rows of pull knobs on the front, each one labeled with a different brand: Marlboro, Camel, Winston, Lucky Strike, Pall Mall. You inserted your coins, pulled the knob, and a pack of cigarettes dropped into the tray at the bottom. No identification required, no questions asked. A 10-year-old with enough change could buy a pack as easily as anyone else, and for decades, nobody considered that a problem. At their peak in the 1960s, vending machines accounted for a significant share of all cigarette sales in America.
Health regulations, age verification laws, and the broader decline in smoking eventually killed the machines.
Most states banned them from locations accessible to minors, and the remaining machines were removed from bars and private clubs by the early 2000s. The sight of a cigarette vending machine in a public space would be genuinely shocking today, but for an entire generation it was as ordinary as a water fountain. Number 37. The ink pad and rubber stamp. Every desk in every office in America had at least one. The rubber stamp was a wooden-handled block with raised letters on the bottom, and the ink pad was a small tin box filled with a felt cushion saturated in ink. You pressed the stamp onto the pad, then pressed it onto the paper, leaving a crisp impression. Paid, received, copy, confidential, a date, a return address, or a company logo. The process was tactile and satisfying. Banks used them on deposit slips. Doctors used them on prescription forms. Libraries used them on due date cards. The self-inking stamp, which carried its own pad inside the housing, reduced the mess but not the ritual. Digital document management, electronic signatures, and paperless workflows have made most stamping unnecessary. The stamps and pads still exist in some offices, but they sit in drawers largely untouched, relics of a paper-based system that has mostly moved to screens. Number 36. The spinning postcard rack. It stood near the entrance of every gift shop, drugstore, souvenir stand, and hotel lobby in America. The spinning postcard rack was a tall wire frame mounted on a rotating base, with rows of slots that held postcards upright so you could flip through them while browsing. Each card showed a local landmark, a scenic view, a humorous illustration, or a photograph of the town with "Greetings from" printed across the front in colorful block letters. Buying a postcard, writing a quick message on the back, and mailing it to a friend or relative back home was one of the most common vacation rituals in America for the better part of a century. The racks were cheap to stock and easy to maintain, and the cards cost a quarter or less. Digital photography and text messaging made the postcard feel unnecessary. Why mail a photograph of the Grand Canyon when you can send one from your phone in real time? The spinning racks still exist in a few tourist spots, but they turn slowly now, and the cards inside them go unsold for months. Number 35. The Stamp Moistener. It was a small glass or plastic bottle with a sponge-tipped applicator, and it sat on the desk of anyone who mailed more than a few letters a day. The stamp moistener existed because licking postage stamps was unpleasant, unhygienic, and left a terrible taste in your mouth. The sponge tip held just enough water to moisten the gum on the back of a stamp without soaking the paper. You pressed the stamp against the sponge, turned it over, and placed it on the envelope. Some models were freestanding bottles shaped like little towers. Others were flat trays with a rolling sponge that you dragged the stamp across. Post offices and mail rooms used larger trough-style moisteners that could handle hundreds of stamps an hour. Self-adhesive stamps, which the United States Postal Service began rolling out in the early 1990s, eliminated the need for moistening entirely. By the 2000s, virtually all American stamps were peel and stick, and the stamp moistener, along with the distinctive flavor of stamp glue, was gone. Number 34. The Sony Walkman. When Sony released the TPS-L2 in July of 1979, it changed the way human beings experienced music. The Walkman was a small portable cassette player with lightweight headphones, and it allowed a person to walk, jog, commute, or sit in a park while listening to their own music, privately, without disturbing anyone around them. Nothing like it had existed before. The transistor radio played whatever the station broadcast. The boombox was shared and loud. The Walkman was personal. You chose the tape, you pressed play, and the world around you acquired a soundtrack that only you could hear. Sony sold over 200 million Walkman units across its various models. The blue and silver original became a design icon. Competitors flooded the market with cheaper versions, but the Walkman name became generic, the way people said Kleenex for tissue. The portable CD player overtook it in the 1990s, and the iPod replaced the entire category in the 2000s. But the Walkman was the beginning. It created the idea of personal, portable, private music, and every device that followed owes something to that first small silver box. Number 33. The Pocket Address Book. It was a small, usually leather-bound booklet with alphabetized tabs along the side, just large enough to fit in a purse or a jacket pocket. Each tab section provided lined pages for writing names, addresses, and telephone numbers in pencil or ink. The pocket address book was how most people kept track of the people in their lives before the digital contact list existed. Updating it meant crossing out old entries and squeezing in new ones. And over time, the pages became a layered record of friendships, moves, and life changes. A well-used address book was deeply personal, filled with the handwriting of years. Losing one was a genuine crisis because the information inside could not be recovered from any backup. The digital address book on personal computers, and later on cell phones, made the pocket version unnecessary by the early 2000s. The smartphone consolidated contacts, calendars, and communication into a single device, and the little leather book with its alphabetical tabs joined the growing list of objects that the phone replaced. Number 32. The Multi-Line Office Telephone. It was a beige or black plastic block with a handset, a row of blinking line buttons along the bottom, and a hold button that nobody trusted. The multi-line office phone was standard equipment on every desk in every American workplace from the 1970s through the 2000s. Each lit button represented a separate phone line, and pressing one picked up that line while the others blinked with calls on hold. Receptionists managed 6 or 8 lines simultaneously, transferring calls by pressing buttons in rapid sequence. The phone also had a speaker button for hands-free conversation, an intercom function for reaching other extensions, and a speed dial list programmed by pressing a sequence of keys that only the office manager understood. AT&T, Nortel, and Panasonic dominated the market. The transition to voice-over internet systems and cell phones made the physical multi-line phone unnecessary. Offices that once had a phone on every desk now have employees who make calls from laptops and personal smartphones, and the blinking row of line buttons is a sight that younger workers have never encountered. Number 31. The mechanical coin sorter. Banks and small businesses kept them on the counter, and some families had smaller versions at home. The mechanical coin sorter was a simple device, usually a metal or plastic tray with graduated slots that separated pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters by diameter. You dumped a jar of loose change onto the top, shook or tilted the tray, and the coins slid into the correct channels, ready to be stacked into paper wrappers. The hand-crank versions used gravity and a spinning disc to route coins into tubes. Counting and wrapping coins was a regular chore for cashiers, tellers, and anyone who kept a change jar on the dresser. Electronic coin counting machines at grocery stores, the kind that charge a percentage, replaced the manual process for most consumers. Debit cards and contactless payments have reduced the use of coins so dramatically that many people no longer accumulate enough loose change to justify owning a sorter at all. Number 30. The tube tester at the hardware store. In the 1950s and 1960s, nearly every hardware store, drugstore, and television repair shop in America had a tube tester near the entrance. It was a large upright cabinet, often made by Hickok or B&K, with rows of sockets on the front panel and a dial that indicated whether a vacuum tube was good, weak, or bad. When the television picture went fuzzy, the sound crackled, or the radio stopped working, the problem was almost always a blown vacuum tube. The homeowner would open the back of the set, carefully pull out the suspect tubes, carry them to the hardware store in a paper bag, and test each one on the machine. Bad tubes were replaced from a rack of new ones sold right next to the tester. The process was self-service. No technician was needed. The tube tester empowered ordinary people to maintain their own electronics, which was remarkable for an era when the inner workings of a television set were genuinely complex. Transistors began replacing vacuum tubes in consumer electronics through the 1960s, and by the 1970s, solid-state circuits had made the tube obsolete in nearly every application except high-end audio amplifiers. The tube testers disappeared from store floors, the racks of replacement tubes were cleared, and an entire culture of home electronics repair went with them. The hardware store became a place for screws and paint instead of radio parts, and the skill of reading a tube tester dial became something that only a handful of aging hobbyists still remember. Number 29. The compact disc long box. When compact discs first appeared in retail stores in the mid-1980s, they came packaged inside a cardboard long box that was exactly twice the height of the jewel case. The long box was 6 inches wide and 12 inches tall, which made it the same dimensions as a vinyl record, so retailers could display CDs in existing record store bins without redesigning their fixtures. The packaging was entirely wasteful. The disc and its jewel case sat in the bottom half, and the top half was nothing but printed cardboard, often with album artwork, promotional text, or advertising. You bought the long box, tore it open, threw the cardboard away, and kept the jewel case inside. Environmental groups and consumer advocates campaigned against the format for years, pointing out that millions of long boxes were going straight to landfills. The music industry finally abandoned the long box in 1993, switching to standardized jewel case packaging. It was one of the few times consumer pressure actually killed a piece of packaging. Number 28. The telephone shoulder rest. It was a small, curved piece of plastic or rubber that snapped onto the handset of a telephone receiver, creating a wedge-shaped cradle that let you hold the phone between your ear and your shoulder without using your hands. The shoulder rest was essential for anyone who spent long hours on the phone while needing to write, type, or flip through files at the same time. Secretaries, receptionists, salespeople, and real estate agents all used them. The device cost a few dollars and came in generic sizes that fit most standard handsets. Some were padded with foam for comfort during long calls. The shoulder rest solved a real ergonomic problem. Cradling a flat handset against your shoulder without one caused neck strain and headaches. Cordless phones reduced the need somewhat, and headsets offered a better solution. But it was the cell phone, with its flat profile and speakerphone option, that finally made the shoulder rest irrelevant. The small plastic wedge vanished from office supply catalogs in the 2000s. Number 27. The electronic spell checker. Before word processors had built-in spell check, there was a handheld device dedicated to the task. The Franklin Spelling Ace, introduced in the mid-1980s, was the most popular. It was about the size of a pocket calculator, with a small keyboard and a narrow LCD screen. You typed in a word the way you thought it was spelled, pressed enter, and the device displayed the correct spelling along with alternate suggestions. Some models included a thesaurus and basic definitions. Students carried them in backpacks, writers kept them on their desks. Office workers used them to double-check business correspondence before it went out. The Spelling Ace and its competitors sold millions of units, but the functionality was so easily replicated by software that the standalone spell checker became one of the first casualties of the personal computer era. Word processing programs included spell check by default, and the red squiggly underline became the universal signal for a misspelled word. The handheld spell checker was obsolete by the mid-1990s. Number 26. The microcassette tape. Smaller than a standard compact cassette by about half, the microcassette was designed for voice recording rather than music. It was the format of choice for answering machines, portable dictation recorders, and handheld voice memos from the late 1970s through the early 2000s. Olympus and Sony were the dominant manufacturers. Journalists used microcassette recorders in interviews. Students recorded lectures. Business travelers dictated notes while driving. Answering machines consumed millions of the tiny tapes, each one holding about 30 minutes of messages per side. The tape was so small it was easy to lose, and the playback quality was functional rather than pleasant. But it served its purpose, capturing the human voice in a compact, portable format. Digital voice recorders arrived in the late 1990s, and the voice memo app on smartphones finished the job. The microcassette disappeared so quietly that most people who used one daily for years would struggle to remember the last time they held one. Number 25. The hot roller set. From the 1970s through the 1990s, a set of electric hot rollers was standard equipment in nearly every American bathroom. The kit was a compact plastic case, about the size of a toaster, with metal or plastic posts that heated up when you plugged it in. Foam or velvet-covered rollers sat on the posts, absorbing heat for a few minutes before you wound them into sections of damp hair and secured them with metal clips or plastic pins. The rollers set the hair into curls or waves as they cooled, a process that took about 20 minutes. Clairol, Conair, and Remington were the dominant brands. Pageant contestants, news anchors, and suburban mothers all relied on them for volume and bounce. The flat iron and the curling wand eventually replaced the hot roller by offering faster, more controlled results, and changing hairstyle preferences moved away from the structured curl. The plastic cases ended up in closets and under bathroom sinks, still holding their original rollers, unused for years. Number 24. The VHS camcorder. In the mid-1980s, the home video camera went from a specialized piece of equipment to a family essential. The VHS camcorder was a bulky, shoulder-mounted device that recorded video directly onto a full-size or compact VHS tape. JVC, Panasonic, and RCA made the most popular models. The camera weighed several pounds and required a firm grip and a steady arm. A flip-out viewfinder, usually black and white, let you see what you were recording. Battery life was measured in minutes rather than hours. Families documented everything: birthday parties, school plays, first steps, holiday mornings, backyard barbecues, monde bijou. The tapes were labeled with masking tape and a marker and stored on a shelf next to the regular movie collection. Watching them meant rewinding, inserting the tape into the living room VCR, and gathering the family on the couch. The digital camcorder, and then the camera phone, made the VHS version obsolete within a few years. The tapes survive in boxes and drawers across the beer country, slowly degrading, holding footage that many families have never converted to a digital format and may never watch again. Number 23. The tractor feed dot matrix printer paper. It came in a continuous folded stack connected by perforated seams with a strip of holes running down each side. The holes engaged with the sprockets, or tractors, inside the printer, pulling the paper through the mechanism in a steady, noisy feed. The dot matrix printer hammered each character onto the page through an ink ribbon, and the sound was a high-pitched grinding whine that anyone who worked in an office in the 1980s can still hear in their memory. After printing, you tore the perforated strips off the sides, a process that was oddly satisfying and left a clean edge. The paper was cheap, lightweight, and available in boxes of 1,000 sheets. Invoices, inventory lists, payroll reports, and interoffice memos all came off the dot matrix printer on that continuous feed paper. Laser and inkjet printers replaced the dot matrix by the mid-1990s, switching to standard cut sheets, and the perforated tractor feed paper disappeared from office supply stores. Number 22. The manual credit card imprinter. Retail workers called it the knuckle buster, and the name was earned. The manual credit card imprinter was a flat metal device with a sliding handle. You placed the customer's credit card face up in the bed of the machine, laid a carbon copy sales slip on top, and pulled the handle firmly across the card, pressing the raised numbers and letters into the paper to create an imprint. The carbon slip produced a merchant copy and a customer copy in one motion. The sliding handle required real force, and doing it hundreds of times a day left your knuckles sore. The imprinter sat next to the cash register in every retail store, gas station, and restaurant in America from the 1950s through the 1990s. Electronic point-of-sale terminals replaced it by reading the magnetic stripe instead of embossing the number, and chip readers completed the transition. Some merchants kept an imprinter in a drawer as a backup for when the electronic system went down, but even that practice has faded. Number 21. The glass milk bottle. Before waxed cartons and plastic jugs, milk came in thick glass bottles with a narrow neck and a foil or cardboard cap. The milkman delivered them before dawn, and the empties were set out for collection and reuse. The bottles held a quart or a half gallon and were heavy enough to double as doorstops. Miv. In winter, the milk froze on the porch, pushing the cream up through the cap in a column of white. Children fought over who got to peel off the cap and lick the cream underneath. The bottles were embossed with the name of the local dairy, and each region had its own brands. Supermarkets offering lower prices ended home delivery through the 1960s, and the glass bottle gave way to cartons and plastic. The returnable bottle was one of the earliest circular packaging systems, and it worked for decades. Its disappearance had nothing to do with the bottle itself and everything to do with how Americans chose to buy their groceries. Number 20. The compact disc wallet. Once compact discs became the dominant music format in the 1990s, the question of how to store and transport them created its own product category. The CD wallet was a zippered fabric case, usually made of nylon or faux leather, with rows of soft plastic sleeves that held individual discs without their jewel cases. Or one end held anywhere from 24 to over 200 discs. Commuters kept them in the car. College students kept them in dorm rooms. DJs carried oversized versions to gigs. The wallet solved a real problem. Jewel cases cracked easily, took up too much space, and were impossible to organize in a moving vehicle. Removing the disc from its original case and slipping it into a wallet sleeve became a weekend project, one that often involved choosing which albums made the cut and which stayed on the shelf at home. Digital music files, first on iPods and then on streaming services, eliminated the need to carry physical discs at all, and the CD wallet went from essential to forgotten in less than a decade. Number 19. The green screen computer terminal. Before the personal computer with its color monitor and graphical interface, most office workers interacted with computers through a dumb terminal, a keyboard and a monochrome screen that displayed nothing but text in glowing green or amber characters on a black background. The terminal had no processing power of its own. It connected to a central mainframe or mini-computer via a cable, and everything you typed was processed on the distant machine and sent back to your screen. IBM 3270 terminals and DEC VT100 models were the industry standards. Data entry clerks, airline reservation agents, bank tellers, and library staff all stared at green screens for 8 hours a day. The glow of that phosphor text in a dim room is one of the defining visual memories of office life in the 1970s and 1980s. Personal computers with graphical user interfaces replaced the dumb terminal in the 1990s, and client-server architecture made the centralized mainframe model unnecessary for most businesses. Number 18. The split-flap departure board. Airports and train stations displayed arrival and departure information on a mechanical board made of rows of small hinged panels that rotated with a distinctive fluttering clatter whenever the schedule updated. The Italian company Solari di Udine manufactured the most famous version. Each panel showed a letter or number, and when a flight or train changed status, the panels flipped in rapid sequence until the correct character appeared, producing a cascading ripple of sound that echoed through the terminal. The split-flap board was both functional and beautiful, a piece of analog engineering that turned raw scheduling data into a public performance. Travelers learned to watch and listen for their departure row to flip. Digital LED and LCD screens replaced the mechanical boards starting in the 1990s because they were cheaper to maintain and easier to update remotely. A handful of stations around the world still operate the original Solari boards as heritage features, but in most airports the fluttering sound of the departure board is gone, replaced by the silent glow of a flat screen. Number 17. The 35mm SLR film camera. For nearly half a century, the single-lens reflex camera was the standard tool of professional and serious amateur photographers alike. The SLR used a mirror and prism system that let you see exactly what the lens saw through an optical viewfinder, and it accepted interchangeable lenses that could be swapped for different focal lengths and shooting situations. Nikon, Canon, Minolta, Pentax, and Olympus were the major manufacturers, and each brand cultivated a loyal following that bordered on devotion. The camera body was a precision mechanical instrument. Winding the film advance lever after each shot cocked the shutter and moved the film strip forward by exactly 1 frame. The shutter itself was a set of metal or cloth curtains that opened and closed in fractions of a second, and the satisfying click it produced became one of the most recognized sounds in the world. A roll of 35mm film held 24 or 36 exposures, and once the roll was finished, you rewound it into the cartridge, removed it from the camera, and sent it to a lab for processing. The limitation was also the discipline. You could not see your photographs until the film was developed, which meant every shot required thought, framing, focus, exposure, timing. There were no second chances and no delete button. Professional photographers shot thousands of rolls a year, but each individual frame carried weight. The digital SLR arrived in the early 2000s and offered the same lens ecosystem with the added ability to review images instantly on a rear screen. Within a decade, film sales had collapsed. Kodak, the company most associated with photographic film, filed for bankruptcy in 2012. The mechanical film SLR, with its mirror slap and its wind lever and its finite roll of 36 chances, was replaced by a device that could take 10,000 photographs without reloading. The convenience was undeniable. What was lost was harder to name. Number 16. The coin-operated parking meter. The first parking meter was installed in Oklahoma City in 1935, and within a few decades they lined the curbs of every downtown in America. The standard design was a cast-iron post topped by a dome-shaped head with a coin slot and a small window that displayed the remaining time on a mechanical dial. You fed it nickels, dimes, or quarters, turned the handle, and the dial began counting down. When the time expired, a red violation flag popped up in the window, and a parking enforcement officer could issue a ticket. The meters were a constant presence in the daily rhythm of downtown life, feeding the meter, checking the meter, running back to the car because the meter was about to expire. Digital meters that accepted credit cards began appearing in the 2000s, and many cities have since replaced individual meters entirely with pay-by-app systems or centralized kiosks. The cast-iron single-space meter with its coin slot and its red flag is disappearing from American streets, and the phrase "feeding the meter" is losing its literal meaning. Number 15. The telegram. For over a century, the telegram was the fastest way to send an urgent message across a long distance. Western Union dominated the American market, and its offices were in every city and most small towns. You walked in, wrote your message on a form, and an operator transmitted it in Morse code, or later by teletype to the nearest office to the recipient, where it was printed on a strip of paper, pasted onto a yellow form, and delivered by a messenger, often a boy on a bicycle. Telegrams were charged by the word, which is why they were famously brief and punctuated with stop instead of periods. Receiving a telegram was an event. The yellow envelope carried weight, good news, bad news, but always important news. Families dreaded the sight of a Western Union messenger during wartime. The telephone, and then email, eroded the telegram's purpose over decades. Western Union sent its last telegram in 2006, ending 155 years of service. The yellow envelope, once a symbol of urgency itself, is now a piece of history. Number 14. The computer mouse with a rubber ball. Before optical and laser tracking, the computer mouse navigated the screen using a small rubber ball housed in the underside of the device. As you moved the mouse across a desk or a mouse pad, the ball rolled against two internal rollers that translated the motion into cursor movement on the screen. The system worked, but it required maintenance. Dust, lint, and skin oils accumulated on the ball and the rollers, causing the cursor to skip, stick, or drift. Cleaning the mouse meant popping open the retaining ring on the bottom, removing the ball, and scraping the grime off the rollers with a fingernail or a cotton swab. It was a small, slightly disgusting ritual that every computer user in the 1990s performed regularly. Microsoft, Logitech, and Apple all made ball mice. The optical mouse, which used a light sensor instead of a mechanical ball, appeared in the late 1990s and eliminated the maintenance problem entirely. The ball mouse vanished from store shelves within a few years. Number 13. The carbonless copy form. Before photocopiers were on every floor of every office, and before digital records made paper copies unnecessary, the carbonless copy form was how businesses created instant duplicates of handwritten documents. The forms, also called NCR paper after the National Cash Register Company that developed them, were stacked in sets of 2, 3, or 4 sheets, each a different color, white on top, then yellow, pink, and sometimes gold. When you wrote on the top sheet, a chemical coating transferred the impression to the sheets below without any carbon paper in between. Invoices, purchase orders, work orders, delivery receipts, and traffic tickets all used carbonless copy forms. The writer kept one copy, the customer got another, and the office filed a third. The system was elegant and reliable, and it worked without electricity or machinery. Digital record-keeping and electronic signatures have made the multi-part form largely unnecessary, though a few industries still use them where a physical paper trail is required by regulation. Number 12. The photo-negative strip. When a roll of film was developed, the processing lab returned two things: a set of printed photographs and a strip of negatives. The negatives were the original film itself, cut into segments of 4 or 5 frames, showing the image in reversed tones. Light areas appeared dark, and dark areas appeared light. They were delicate and easily scratched, so the lab slipped them into clear plastic sleeves for protection. The negatives were your backup. If you wanted a reprint, an enlargement, or a correction, you brought the negative strip back to the photo counter, and the lab used it to produce a new print. Losing the negatives meant losing the ability to reproduce the image at its original quality. Families stored them in shoe boxes, in the backs of photo albums, or in envelopes alongside the prints. Digital photography eliminated the concept of a negative entirely, and the translucent strips of reversed images, once the most important part of the photographic process, are now curiosities that most children have never seen held up to the light. Number 11. The paper airline ticket. Flying commercially once involved a physical document, a multi-page paper ticket booklet with carbon copy flight coupons, a passenger receipt, and an auditor's coupon, all bound in a cardstock cover printed with the airline's logo. The ticket agent tore out the appropriate coupon at each leg of the journey and returned the booklet to the passenger. Losing your ticket was a genuine emergency because without it you could not board the plane, and replacing it required paperwork, fees, and sometimes a visit to the airline's city ticket office. Travel agents issued tickets using machines that printed the flight details onto pre-printed stock, and the tickets were delivered by mail or picked up in person. The International Air Transport Association introduced electronic ticketing in the 1990s, and by 2008 paper tickets were no longer accepted by most airlines worldwide. The boarding pass survived on paper a bit longer, but mobile check-in has made even that increasingly rare. Number 10. The While You Were Out message pad. In the decades before voicemail and email, a missed phone call at the office meant a handwritten note. The While You Were Out message pad was a small block of pink or yellow carbonless slips, each pre-printed with fields for the caller's name, phone number, time of call, and a row of checkboxes. Telephoned, called to see you, wants to see you, please call, will call again, returned your call. The receptionist or secretary filled in the details, tore off the slip, and placed it on the intended recipient's desk, sometimes under a paperweight or stuck to the phone. A busy executive might return from lunch to find a dozen pink slips fanned across the desk. The message pad was a universal piece of office culture from the 1950s through the 1990s, produced by companies like Adams and Topps. Voicemail systems made the pad redundant for most offices by the late 1990s, and email finished the job. Number 9. The Kodachrome slide. For professional and serious amateur photographers, Kodachrome was not just a type of film, it was the standard. Introduced by Kodak in 1935, Kodachrome was a color reversal film that produced positive transparencies, small rectangular frames of film mounted in 2x2-inch cardboard or plastic mounts. The colors were rich, saturated, and remarkably stable over time. National Geographic photographers shot on Kodachrome for decades, and many of the most iconic images of the 20th century were captured on it. Family slideshows were a fixture of suburban life. The projector was set up in the living room, the screen was pulled down, the lights went off, and trays of Kodachrome slides clicked through one by one while someone narrated the vacation. The film required a specialized developing process available only at Kodak-authorized labs, which limited its accessibility but maintained quality control. Kodak discontinued Kodachrome in 2009, and the last processing lab, Duane's Photo in Parsons, Kansas, developed its final roll that same year. Paul Simon wrote a song about it. That is how much it mattered. Number 8. The data cassette. Before floppy disks became affordable, home computer users stored their programs and data on ordinary audio cassette tapes. The Commodore 64, the TRS-80, the ZX Spectrum, and the Apple II all supported cassette storage in their early configurations. You connected the computer to a standard cassette recorder with a cable, typed a command, and pressed play. The computer converted the audio signal on the tape back into digital data, a process that took several minutes for even a simple program. Loading a game could mean sitting and waiting for 5 to 10 minutes while the tape whined and warbled, and if the volume level was wrong or the tape had a dropout, the load would fail and you had to start over. Saving data was the reverse. The computer generated a series of tones that the recorder captured on tape. The entire system was slow, unreliable, and frustrating, but it was cheap, and for the first generation of home computer users, it was the only option. Floppy disk drives replaced cassette storage by the mid-1980s, and the data cassette became a footnote in computing history. Number 7. The oscillating desk fan with metal blades. Before central air conditioning became standard in American homes and offices, the desk fan was how most people survived the heat. The classic models had heavy cast iron or chrome bases, a cage of open wire mesh around the blades, and a small motor that swept the fan back and forth in a slow arc. The blades were stamped metal, and they moved enough air to make a real difference in a stuffy room. The wire guard was wide enough to fit a child's finger through, which meant every household had at least one story about someone getting too close. Brands like Emerson, General Electric, and Westinghouse produced models that ran for decades without maintenance. Modern safety regulations eventually required tighter blade guards and plastic fan blades, and central air conditioning reduced the need for desktop airflow entirely. The old metal blade fans became collector's items valued for their industrial design and their surprising durability. But their era as essential household equipment is long over. Number 6. The spring-loaded bathroom scale. For most of the 20th century, the bathroom scale was a flat platform with an analog dial behind a small window near your toes. You stepped on, the needle swung to the right, and you read your weight in pounds. The mechanism inside was a simple spring that compressed under your body weight and moved the dial through a lever system. Detecto, Health-O-Meter, and Borg were the best-known brands. The scale sat on the bathroom floor, usually next to the toilet or the bathtub, and every member of the household used it. The readings were approximate at best. The needle wobbled, the calibration drifted over time, and the number you saw depended on where you placed your feet. Digital scales with strain gauge sensors arrived in the 1990s and offered precise, stable readings displayed on an LCD screen. The old spring scale, with its shaky needle and its generous margin of error, was replaced by a device that told the truth with uncomfortable accuracy. Number 5. The portable weather radio. The National Weather Service began broadcasting continuous weather information on dedicated frequencies in the 1970s, and for decades the portable weather radio was a fixture in kitchens, garages, and storm shelters across America. It was a small, battery-powered receiver, usually made by Midland or Radio Shack, that picked up NOAA weather broadcasts on 7 VHF frequencies. The better models had an alert feature that activated automatically when the National Weather Service issued a warning for your area, waking you up in the middle of the night with a loud tone followed by a computerized voice describing the threat. In tornado country and along hurricane coastlines, the weather radio was considered essential emergency equipment. Smartphone weather apps with push notifications have largely replaced it, delivering the same alerts with more detail and geographic precision. The dedicated weather radio that once sat plugged in on the kitchen counter has quietly disappeared from most homes, remembered now mainly by the people who once relied on that loud tone in the middle of the night. Number 4. The pneumatic tube canister. In department stores, banks, hospitals, and large office buildings, pneumatic tube systems carried small items through networks of pressurized pipes at high speed. The canister was a cylindrical container, usually about 8 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, made of hard plastic or metal with rubber gaskets on each end. You placed a document, a cash deposit, a prescription, or a message inside the canister, sealed it, inserted it into a sending station, and air pressure propelled it through the tube network to its destination in seconds. Department stores used them to send sales receipts from the floor to the cashier's office. Banks used them at drive-through lanes, where a customer placed a check in the canister and watched it whoosh through a clear tube to the teller inside. Hospitals used them to transport lab samples between floors. Digital communication and electronic record-keeping eliminated most of the need for physical document transport, and the distinctive whoosh of the pneumatic canister is now heard in fewer places each year. Number 3. The library due date card. For most of the 20th century, every book in every public library in America had a small paper pocket glued inside the front or back cover, and inside that pocket was a card. When you checked out the book, the librarian pulled the card from the pocket, stamped it with the due date using a rubber date stamp, and filed it in a tray behind the desk. Your name was written on the card, and if you opened a library book before checking it out, you could see every person who had borrowed it before you. A quiet history of readers written in different hands. The card and pocket system was the backbone of library circulation for decades. Some cards showed dozens of names spanning years. Barcode scanners and computerized checkout systems replaced the card system starting in the 1980s, and by the 2000s most libraries had removed the pockets and cards from their collections entirely. The handwritten record of who had read a book, and when, disappeared with them. Number 2. The hourglass egg timer. It was a small glass instrument, usually about 4 inches tall, mounted in a wooden or plastic frame. 2 glass bulbs were connected by a narrow neck, and fine white sand flowed from the upper bulb to the lower one in exactly 3 minutes, the time needed to soft boil an egg. You flipped it over, set it on the counter, and watched the sand trickle down. When the upper bulb was empty, the egg was ready. The hourglass egg timer was a kitchen staple for generations, valued for its simplicity and its complete independence from batteries or electricity. It worked the same way it had worked for centuries. The mechanical kitchen timer, and later the digital timer and the smartphone, offered more flexibility and precision, but none of them had the quiet elegance of sand falling through glass. The hourglass egg timer is still available, but it has moved from the kitchen counter to the gift shop shelf, sold more as a decorative object than as a cooking tool. Number 1. The incandescent light bulb. For more than a century, the incandescent bulb was the most universal everyday object in the world. Thomas Edison's 1879 version, with its carbonized bamboo filament inside a glass vacuum bulb, was the one that lasted long enough to change civilization. The design barely changed in the decades that followed. A thin tungsten filament heated to over 4,000 degrees inside a glass bulb, producing a warm yellowish light that became the default color of home, office, and street. The standard 60-watt frosted bulb with its Edison screw base was in every lamp, every ceiling fixture, and every porch light in America. It was cheap, easy to replace, and universally understood. The problem was efficiency. An incandescent bulb converted only about 5% of its energy into light. The rest was heat. LED bulbs arrived in the 2000s offering the same output at a fraction of the energy cost, and federal standards phased out most standard incandescents by 2014. The bulb that lit the world for over 100 years was replaced by something better in every measurable way. But the warm glow of a tungsten filament, the way it softened a room and made the evening feel like the evening, is something no LED has quite managed to replicate, and that is 100 everyday objects that have become obsolete. Some disappeared because something better came along. Some vanished because the world they were built for simply changed, and some were gone before anyone thought to say goodbye. If you grew up with any of these, you already know what they felt like in your hands, what they sounded like, and exactly where they sat in the house. Which of these do you remember most? Drop it in the comments. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and thanks for remembering.